Without the knowledge of modern medicine, people couldn't prevent or treat sickness properly. This was proved by William Klaus in his book, A Brief and Necessary Treatise Touching the Cure of the Disease called Morbus Gallicus, or Lues Venerea, by functions and other approved ways of curing. In this writing from 1585, Klaus attempts to describe ways to treat syphilis, which had become widespread after the French invaded Naples in 1494. The old way of treating diseases was bloodletting, which is the process of creating lacerations to let the disease out of the body. Due to the lack of medical knowledge of how diseases worked, the doctors practiced the bloodletting without knowing it did not work. Though it was unsuccessful, it brought people of the time closer to examining biology and farther away from prayer. During the time, the Protestant Reformation was going on, and either people ran away from religion or they were scared into following in fear of God's wrath. Many diseases and unfortunate events were often said to be a sign from God in how he was angry, but with the Reformation, some people began to look past belief and more into actual medicine.
During the 14th century, the world was struck with one of the worst pandemics in human history, the Black Plague. 300 years later, the last major epidemic of bubonic plague hit England. The disease was spread by rats carrying infected fleas. The rats were attracted to cities littered with trash and waste, which meant highly populated areas were at risk for exposure. By the summer of 1665, the plague was rampant in London. Bodies were piling up, and plague pits were constantly being dug to sustain the mass number of diseased corpses. As the rich fled the city, the poor were forced to stay and endure the stench of their decomposing townsfolk, gambling with the risk of infection. Though there was no thorough understanding of the cause or treatment of the plague, government implemented rules and orders to contain the outbreak. Pets were to be kept indoors, those infected were to be removed and quarantined. Those fleeing had to have proof of health. By 1666, the deaths dropped. Some believed people were becoming more immune to the disease, while others believed the Great Fire of London in September put an end to it. Before its end, however, the Great Plague claimed the lives of more than 100,000 Londoners and became an ominous shadow over the progress of 17th century life. Smallpox has devastated mankind for centuries. While the origin of the disease is lost in history, some people believe it has been around since 10,000 BC. Smallpox was indiscriminate and infected those on all levels of society. In 18th century Europe, approximately 400,000 people died annually of smallpox. About a third of the survivors went blind and were left disfigured. Smallpox was in fact so lethal that it was one of the earliest known forms of biological warfare. During the French Indian War, British forces suggested deliberate use of the disease to wipe out hostile American Indian populations. The slave trade also brought the epidemic from Africa to the Americas. Variolation or inoculation came to Europe at the beginning of the 18th century with travelers from Turkey, though it wasn't until Edward Jenner, an English physician, discovered that a similar yet more mild disease called cowpox could yield an immunity to the much more infectious smallpox. By 1796, the scourge of smallpox was on its way to eradication due to his discovery. Though Dr. Jenner's methods did not create lifelong immunity, his discovery led to further medical advances and a declined mortality rate.
The 19th century was a time where disease spread quickly due to the unhealthy living situations most people found themselves in. During the Industrial Revolution, more and more people moved into the already crowded cities. With a rise in population, disease was able to spread at record rates. Smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, and cholera were the diseases that were most common in the 1800s. Cholera is a disease that is first contracted through the drinking of contaminated water. This is why the lower class was the most affected, because they did not have the proper tools for sewage disposal and personal hygiene. With cholera being so fatal, it caused mass panic throughout London. It made people fearful of drinking water, which leads to people becoming dehydrated and sick. It was like the Grim Reaper was the one pumping the water from the well, killing anyone who drank from it. Dr. John Snow studied the cholera outbreak in London and found out where the origin of cholera was. He then traced it back to a few specific drinking wells. Dr. Snow was able to deduce that each infected person drank from the same drinking wells. The red dots on the map are people who died from cholera, and the small blue marks are different drinking wells. He was able to find the water wells that were contaminated and was able to find a way to decontaminate those wells. Dr. Snow was able to save many lives, and he was able to spread the message about how personal hygiene, for example, washing your hands, can really help keep a person healthy. During the 20th century, death from infectious disease dropped a considerable amount. Living conditions improved all around the world, which lengthened the human lifespan. Even though living conditions improved during the 1900s, disease was still common. By the end of the 20th century, more than half of the deaths were caused by heart disease and different kinds of cancers. Though heart disease and cancer were common in the 1900s, the 20th century also had the 1918 influenza pandemic. The 1918 influenza pandemic, or Spanish flu, was caused by the H1N1 virus and resulted in around 500 million people being infected worldwide, with about 700,000 Americans and 50 million people dying worldwide.